Today I'm going to talk to you about the similarities and the differences between the Gen 1 Audi R8 and the Lamborghini Gallardo. Now, it's widely known that the V10 edition of the Audi R8 shares both an engine and a platform with the Lamborghini Gallardo. However, there are some significant differences that make the way you experience these two cars completely different. And that's the reason why I ended up choosing to own both of them. So I'm going to take you out on the road, both in my Audi R8 GT Spyder and my Lamborghini Gallardo LP 570-4 Superleggera Edizione Tecnica. And when we take these cars out on the road and experience the very different driving dynamics, I'm going to try and answer the question, did Audi intentionally compromise the R8 in order to make the Lamborghini seem like the better car? Once we hit the road in both these cars later in the video, I want to share that experience with you as much as possible through plenty of POV driving shots in 4K, all thanks to the Insta360 Go 3S. The Go 3S with its action pod makes this an action camera with a cool party trick, where the compact camera module can separate from the main body for increased versatility. I'll tell you a little more about the camera in a few minutes. For now, a huge thank you to Insta360 for sponsoring this video. Back to the R8 GT and Gallardo Superleggera. Now, both these cars are the lightweight editions of their respective models. The Audi R8 GT Coupe came in at around 100 kilos lighter than its standard counterpart, and the Spyder comes in at 85 kilos lighter, making it around the same weight as the standard coupe. However, they did some interesting things to stiffen and lighten the chassis, including a magnesium engine frame, various cutouts in the chassis, and strengthening down the transmission tunnel. Overall, stiffening the car and making it feel a lot more like a coupe driving experience, yet with a little more power and a much more dynamic chassis and suspension setup. The Gallardo Superleggera, or Superlight, came in at around 100 kilos lighter than its standard Gallardo counterpart, but that was 100 kilos lighter again than the Audi R8. So all in, this is around 200 kilos lighter than the GT Spyder. However, there is something else, a very specific dimension to this car that when you see it, you'll know exactly why these cars handle so differently to each other. But before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about some of the other more obvious differences. I'm here today at Hilton & Moss, where I use their car storage services as well as their detailing services. And they were looking after these cars and made sure they were clean and ready for me to film today. A huge thank you to Hilton & Moss for your hospitality and looking after me today. Now, the Audi has gone for a much more elegant design, much more in tune with the Audi DNA at the time. Some say it looks like a squished TT, but I think these distinguish themselves quite significantly from an Audi TT, but that's just me. Maybe I'm biased. And with the GT, it has the additional accents of the front splitter and the GT spoiler, which was very much copied thereafter. I've talked about this all in detail in another video, but you can see that the car was going for a more elegant design. And personally, I wasn't crazy about the styling of the coupe, but I really did like the styling of the Spyder, especially once the roof is down. Whereas the Lamborghini Gallardo has a much more aggressive design, which I quite like. And this is one of the reasons why I think I actually like having both of these cars, not just because one is a Spyder and one is a coupe, so in the summer months I can get the roof down and enjoy the sound of that V10 in a way that you just can't in a coupe, but also because of the styling. The styling is just so very different between these cars. Now, one of the differences you'll notice quite obviously between the Gallardo and the Coupe R8 is the fact that the Lamborghini has a lower roofline, around 77 millimeters lower. However, reportedly, the actual underside of the car has 130 millimeter clearance versus around 110 millimeters for the GT. And you can see why when you see the wheel gap on the Superleggera versus the R8 GT. Now, the GT actually comes with height adjustable coilovers. So there's a collar that you can adjust the height on this car. I've pretty much left it as I received it because it was pretty well set up and I've had an alignment done at RE Performance. This is stock also, but these do not come with height adjustable coilovers. The pre-LP cars had height adjustable coilovers, but these do not, unfortunately. This does come with a front lift, whereas this does not. And I find that the splitter on the front of these does protrude quite a bit more, so I would be a bit more concerned if this was any lower than this. If I had the option of lowering it simply by adjusting the coilovers, I probably would. Let's face it, this wheel gap is a bit too big. But the difference between these two cars that has the biggest impact on its overall driving experience and driving dynamics is one that I think it's just easier if I show you.
Yeah, I gotta keep dreaming, gotta keep going, yeah, I gotta keep pushing, gotta keep breathing, yeah, I gotta keep working, yeah, at least for the moment it's not 1 million, and I want my mansion, so my family knows that.
Now, while these two cars do share an aluminium and composite space frame chassis, there is still a significant difference between the chassis under the skin. Now, if we look at where the axles are lined up at the rear wheels here, and then we move forward, you start to realise that actually the R8 has a longer wheelbase. It's actually around 90 millimeters longer. Now, this actually changes the driving dynamics of the car quite considerably, and in fact, it makes the turning circle slightly wider for the R8. So what we're going to do now, I think, is jump in the cars, take them for a drive, and tell you how exactly that changes the overall experience of driving these cars. Let's start with the R8. A huge thank you to our channel members. You get access to exclusive behind the scenes content and early access to all our videos. If that sounds good to you and you'd like to see even more content like this, please consider becoming a channel member and supporting the channel. This car, oh, there's nothing like it. Oh, really, what a car. Anyway, let's talk about this car. Now, the first thing I should probably talk about is the interior. How does it make you feel when you're sitting in this car? Well, the first gen R8s, I'll be honest, the interior's kind of let them down a little bit. This material here just seems a little bit, I don't know, not cheap, but certainly not premium as you would expect in a car of this caliber. Now, the Gen 2 R8's interiors, they were much nicer, much better. Whatever issues or whatever feedback they had on the first gen, they definitely addressed that in the second gen. The GT upgraded the interior in a number of ways, and this one happens to have all of the carbon options. There was 2 carbon packs for the interior, and this has both of them. It also happens to have some additional Alcantara, which was an aftermarket addition by the previous owner, which I'm very grateful of. I personally think this should have been Alcantara or carbon, but you know, they had to make sure that the Gallardo had something over the R8. Even if it is a GT, even if the GT is rarer than the Superleggera. Now, before I get onto the topic of driving dynamics, I promised I would tell you a little more about the Insta360 Go 3S, the camera I'm using for all the POV shots today. This is arguably one of the most versatile 4K action cameras with its compact camera module and magnetic mounting system, allowing you to place it just about anywhere. In my case, on my cap using the Go 3S Easy Clip. This slides onto your cap either on the peak or on the head strap and can be angled for the optimum POV. What I like about this setup is you don't need a bulky camera on a head strap, which can become uncomfortable after a while. Instead, this feels like it's hardly even there. It also attracts less attention due to its compact size. So now we're just going to cover some general points about the driving dynamics of this car. Well, let's start with the gearbox. Now, a lot of people slate the R-tronic gearboxes, but I actually quite like it. I've explained in a previous video that I think a lot of people just don't understand this gearbox. They expect it to behave like an auto, which a DCT tends to behave like an auto, only better. This behaves like an automated manual, because that's what it is. It's not trying to be an automatic. It is still a manual on the inside, and that means that when you're doing lower speeds like this and you want to change up, you want to give it just a subtle lift on the throttle pedal, just to take some torque away, and then squeeze it back on as you feel the gear engage. That gives you a slightly smoother driving experience at lower speeds. But once you're going flat out, that's no longer necessary. Then you can actually just hold your foot flat to the floor and keep doing those upshifts. And I put this in sport by default because it makes the clutch slip just that little bit less, which is what you want if you want to preserve the life of your clutch. Sport mode gives you some slightly more aggressive downshifts and more aggressive engagement on the upshifts. However, the Gallardo has a third mode, and I'll talk about that once I'm in the Gallardo. Now I'm stuck in a little bit of slow moving traffic at the moment, and this is probably where this car doesn't excel. And let's face it, it's not meant to. This car is built to be more of a track-oriented Spyder experience, and I have taken this car on track, and believe me, having the roof down, it's just a different experience. It's, you know, that open top driving experience is fantastic. Even when you've got your helmet on, you still pick up some of that wind kind of gushing into the car and going underneath the bottom of your helmet, and it keeps your face cool. It's just really, really nice. But for the moment, I am on a public road, and that public road has just been freed up somewhat, so we can have a little bit of fun. Now, when I first got this car, I felt that it had just a little bit too much understeer. Like now, the car is actually quite pointy on the front. Part of that is because it's got an adjustable coilover system, which comes from factory, high adjustable Bilsteins, and I think this has been set up to be just slightly nose forward, so it makes the front of the car a bit more pointy. But despite that, it still had a fair amount of understeer, and that was down to the geometry on the car. So I took this to RE Performance and had them apply their sports geometry. These are a special set of settings that they've developed over the years where they can set the car up so it's a little bit more grippy on the front, doesn't pick up that understeer that's quite characteristic of many R8s. And that particular setup isn't unique to the GT, that can be applied to any R8. Now, apart from the understeer that's quite characteristic of R8s that has been largely dialed out thanks to Ricky, this thing handles like an absolute dream. You wouldn't think that this is a Spyder. Many people have said this drives like a coupe, and they'd be absolutely right. Having driven it on track and on roads like this, it really does. So good. The turning is so brilliant. But one of the things that I love about this car, that I think it does actually better than the Gallardo, is its stability in the corners. And that comes from the fact that it's got the slightly longer wheelbase, 90 millimeters, and that really does make a difference. About the GT is, it is definitely much more of the driver's car than the standard R8, and that is also true of the Superleggera. These seats, these GT bucket seats, are absolutely incredible. You feel so connected to the car. And again, because of this chassis, the way it's set up, and even though it's a Spyder, the way that it handles, it's phenomenal. And the power difference between these two cars is negligible. 560 PS in this, 570 in the Superleg. The cars even sound different. This has just got a higher pitched wail to it, like a banshee. The Miltech exhaust probably contributes to that, but the other thing that contributes to that is the fact that this revs up to a red line of 8,700 RPM. Now, that's not a huge difference, it's only slightly more than the Superleg, but believe me, you notice it in the sound. Just the way that this car feels, the confidence it gives you in the corners, the stability that the chassis has, the feedback that the steering gives you is just, it's just phenomenal. Now, a lot of people said that when I bought the Superleggera that I basically bought the same car because I owned this first, then I bought the Superleggera. So I think rather than, you know, just take it from people saying it in the comments, let's drive both cars back to back, see how similar they are or how different they are, and try and answer the question, did Audi hold back the R8 to allow the Lamborghini Gallardo to shine?
I walk with angels on my shoulder just so I can sleep at night. And these demons in my head whispering things to me I like. And I know it deep way down inside that I should chase it better. I got dreams of having shit I've never had.
Now, I'd like to talk about the same things in roughly the same order as I did in the R8. Now, let's talk first about the interior and how it makes you feel. Well, I'll tell you straight off the bat, the interior on this makes you feel like you're in a car that is worth 40 grand more than the R8, even the R8 GT. Just the whole thing is clad in carbon fiber, Alcantara, and this car has the double carbon pack, just like the R8 GT that I've got has the double carbon pack. But Lamborghini's idea of double carbon and Audi's idea of double carbon at that time were two different things. This is next level. The entire door card is carbon fiber. With this double carbon pack, the dashboard is carbon fiber. The center console is carbon fiber. The switch surround is carbon fiber. Everything's carbon fiber. It is just phenomenal. And this does also have fixed bucket seats. However, these don't squeeze you quite as much around the top of the thigh. They drop away a little bit more, which allows you to have a slightly more comfortable ride. Obviously, there's not a lot of material between you and the carbon fiber of the seat, just like in the R8s, but these are just slightly more comfortable, or slightly less uncomfortable. That might be a more accurate way of representing it. Now, the other thing that you notice when you first get into this car about the interior is your feet position, your pedal position. It's much more offset, and that's because of the shorter wheelbase. Your feet are much closer to the front wheels, so more of the front wheel arch is encroaching into the spaces that you have for your feet. So the inevitable side effect of that is you have that more offset pedal position, which is quite characteristic to these cars. Now, I actually got to sit in the Temerario recently, the new Huracan replacement, and the pedal position for that is actually pretty good. You don't notice it quite as much, but I think that's substantially because the wheelbase on those cars is longer and actually much closer to the R8s, both the first gen and the second gen. Now, the thing with this is I actually don't feel like I need to put this into sport mode once I start driving it. I think that the gearbox mapping on this is slightly better than the R8, even the GT, and the GT had an uprated map. It certainly manages the gears better than a standard R8, but this manages it even better than the GT. And another feature I love about this is that when I come to a stop, I can just pull both pedals and it puts it in neutral, whereas with the R8, you've got to reach over, move the gear lever and put that into neutral, which, when you're in stop-start traffic, can be a bit of a pain. So while I don't feel the need to put this into sport mode, I am going to. In fact, I'm just going to skip over sport entirely and go straight to Corsa. That beep is to warn you that you've got reduced ESC, or reduced electronic stability control. Fortunately today, the roads are nice and dry, the sun is out, the tarmac is a good temperature, and I feel reasonably confident in the car. The sport mode shifts in this versus the R8, very, very similar. You know, quite a harsh change, but in Corsa mode, there's something else. Fortunately, this has the aftermarket paddles inspired by the Aventador, which are much taller, so that when you're going round a corner, you don't have to reach so far to change gear. And that's significant because the paddles don't move with the steering wheel, they remain stationary with the steering column, whereas the R8 has the paddles that move with the steering wheel. So the fact that they're quite small paddles doesn't really matter too much, because your hands are never really moving too far from quarter to three position when you're driving in a spirited fashion and want to know where those paddles are. With this, you kind of have to reach back sometimes when you're in a corner. Now, the tiny, tiny paddles that you get with this, unfortunately, I think they're just a bad idea. Why have paddles so small if you're going to keep them locked to the steering column? They should be moving with the steering wheel. Fortunately, this is overcome with this aftermarket paddle shifter. And as we speak about the paddles, I have it in Corsa mode, so I think we should definitely take advantage of it now that we're on a free bit of road.
One last thing I should mention about the Insta360 Go 3S is its Action Pod. The Action Pod returns the Go 3S to a more conventional action camera form factor that can be mounted on any standard 1/4" threaded mount using the quick release mount, which can carry either the Action Pod or the separate camera module. The extensive camera modes, Action Pod and the ability to mount the Go 3S almost anywhere opens up endless possibilities.
Now, I took my brother out for a drive in this the other day, a spirited drive of course, and by the time we got back, he said that his neck was aching all around the back here from those shifts, and probably from the cornering as well. He doesn't tend to drive in quite a spirited fashion, but honestly, I can't tell you how much that adds to the engagement of this car. This is one of the significant differences between this and the R8 that actually sold me this car. After I drove one, I was like, nope, that's it, I've got to have it. I've absolutely got to have it. And of course, my friend James of JM on Cars said, look, if you're going to look at one of these, it really has to be the coupe. So you've got that significant difference between the weights of the two cars, as well as all of the other differences. And that weight difference does make a difference. You do feel that this car is lighter, it's more nimble, even though it's not the fastest car I've ever driven. I've driven the likes of the 720S and the 296. It feels like it's up there with them. It really, really does. And I think a part of that is how filtered those particular driving experiences are compared to this. The suspension being firmer, that sort of bumping along the road, that connection you feel through these seats. The shorter wheelbase, that makes the car overall much more twitchy in the corners than any of those cars, and much more so than the R8. It's a different thing. It's just more visceral, more emotional. The R8 is a fantastic piece of engineering. It's very precise, it's very stable. That lengthened wheelbase on the first gen R8s compared to the Gallardo, it just changes everything about the handling and dynamics of the car. Oh, this doesn't like bumpy roads very much. Not like the R8. The R8 does cope with the bumps in the road, even with its special GT sports suspension, better than this. It really struggles with the bumps, I won't lie. I wouldn't be surprised if overall the R8 GT would actually be the faster car, just because the suspension would cope with these bumps way better and keep the tyres in contact with the road a lot better than this will. But this is not why we buy these cars. Well, I don't buy these cars to be the fastest thing on the road or the fastest thing on the track. I buy this car for the experience. But the thing that you notice in this is that you don't have as much confidence in it. The car digs into the corner. It's much more fronty, if you know what I mean. It digs in at the front more. The rear rotates more quickly. And as it does, you feel like, oh, it might catch you out. It doesn't, but you feel like it might. That shorter wheelbase makes such a difference. It's not just a geo thing. It is the fact that it's a shorter wheelbase. The back end wants to come around much more quickly than in the R8, which in many ways makes this harder to drive. But because it's harder to drive, it's more engaging. Let's face it, Audi probably did hold the R8 back in a few ways. In coupe form, the R8 GT is still nearly 100 kilos heavier than this. So they clearly held back on the weight savings. They also held back slightly on the power. And on paper, these things are differentiating factors from a marketing perspective when you're trying to sell these cars. Audi also held back considerably on the interior, or maybe it was that Lamborghini didn't hold back on the interior and they went all in, because the Alcantara and carbon fiber in this thing it's just perfect. But I don't think they held back when it came to the handling. I actually think they just approached it with two very different philosophies. I think Audi were going for the best possible handling car that anyone could drive, even in its GT form. I think Lamborghini were going for emotion, drama. They wanted you to feel like you were on the edge every time you drive this car, even if you're just cruising along like I am now. This shorter wheelbase, the stiffer suspension, all of that combined just creates for a much more dynamic and engaging driving experience. From an engineering point of view, it's probably actually worse than the R8, but somehow it just invigorates you. It's visceral. You feel connected to the car even more. You feel connected to the road. Somehow, the R8 is probably the better car from a driving point of view. But this car is the better car from a driver's point of view.
To get a free accessory with your Insta360 Go 3S purchase, subject to availability, please consider using the link in the description or the pinned comment, and in doing so you'll also be supporting the channel.
So if you've enjoyed today, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and hit the bell icon, choose notifications on all videos, and I'll see you next time on SNT.